Welcome to our Acts Bible study. This week we are looking at Acts chapter 17, and today is February 20th, 2026. Here's Acts 17, 16 through 31. While Paul waited for them, that would be Silas and Timothy, in Athens, he was deeply distressed to find that the city was flooded with idols. He began to interact with the Jews and Gentile God worshippers in the synagogue. He also addressed whoever happened to be in the marketplace each day. Certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion too. Some said, "What an amateur! What's he trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods." They said this because he was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. They took him into custody and brought him to the council on Mars Hill. "What is this new teaching? Can we learn what you are talking about? You've told us some strange things and we want to know what they mean." They said this because all Athenians, as well as the foreigners who live in Athens, used to spend their time doing nothing but talking about or listening to the newest thing. Paul stood up in the middle of the council on Mars Hill and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, is Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples made with human hands. Nor is God served by human hands, as though he needed something, since he is the one who gives life, breath, and everything else. From one person, God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. God made the nations so they would seek him, perhaps even reach out to him and find him. In fact, God isn't far away from any of us. In God we live, move, and exist. As some of your own poets said, we are his offspring. Therefore, as God's offspring, we have no need to imagine that the divine being is like a gold, silver, or stone image made by human skill and thought. God overlooks ignorance of these things in times past, but now directs everyone everywhere to change their hearts and lives. This is because God has set a day when he intends to judge the world justly by a man he has appointed. God has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." As Acts 17 begins, Paul and Silas and Timothy are on the road again, and they stop first in Thessalonica, where their teaching gets them crosswise of some of the community, and they have to leave in a hurry. And so then they travel on to Berea with the help of the followers that listened to them and converted in Thessalonica. And they spend some time in Berea, and people from Thessalonica come over and start causing problems for them there as well. And then Paul gets to Athens with some help. And so then we get to the verses that you heard today. And so Paul is trying to figure out how to talk to the people in Athens, how to find an audience like he has other places. And, Athens is a prominent city. There's a lot going on there. And as we found in so many other chapters in Acts, there's a lot of intersection of different religions and different cultures. And so Paul is trying to figure out how to speak to the people there in a way that they can understand and maybe turn to God, right? The God that he is preaching, not all these other ones that he sees statues for. It's interesting that this section starts out with, as Paul is waiting in Athens for Timothy and Silas to join him, he is, it says, troubled or distressed to find that the city was flooded with idols. this is a little unusual because we know that Paul has been in plenty of places where there's a lot of other religious influence. So it's interesting that it notes that. But this is perhaps one place in Acts where we get some, more specific discussion of other schools of thought. Not just, these people believed in Hermes or Zeus, but the Epicureans and the Stoics, and in Athens, it's traditionally a place where different schools of thought are there, and we even get that what I assume to be fairly facetious comment in verse 21. They said this because all Athenians, as well as the foreigners who live in Athens, used to spend their time doing nothing but talking about or listening to the newest thing. So apparently, the writer of Acts isn't a big fan of philosophical debate. But Paul finds himself there, and he finds a way to connect with the people of Athens. They bring him to Mars Hill, which is, a prominent hill in the city. That is where the Parthenon is. It's right next to the Acropolis, near the Acropolis. So the Parthenon is nearby. There's a temple to Nike, the winged victory. So it's an important spot in the city and a really interesting place for Paul to be speaking about this God that the Athenians didn't know anything about. Or at least the writer of Acts tells us that they didn't. And so, as usual, some people listen and are interested in what Paul has to say, and some people think that it's just sort of nonsense. But what I've been thinking about with this chapter of Acts and with Paul's ability to speak to different groups of people, and it tells us, every time that some people listened and followed and turned to what Paul was preaching, and some people didn't. And sometimes in the church we think that everybody has to believe the same way, or everyone has to have the same type of experience of who God is and how their lives are changed. But Paul is kind of a living example that he knows that people are different. People hear differently, people experience God differently, and people are going to come to Christ differently. And so he does what he can to speak to people, as we would say often in the church, where they are. In some cases, literally, because he's going to their cities, he's going to their synagogues, he's going to the places where they're meeting. But also, figuratively, in figuring out what type of conversation, what type of argument is the way that they are used to discussing things, the way that they are most likely to hear and accept the message that he has. And I think that we could value that. We might characterize Paul as being sometimes a little arrogant, sometimes more sure of himself than we like, because he says, I've got this message and I'm going to say it, and I say it the right way, and these other teachers teach people wrong. But it's also really important to remember that Paul worked hard to figure out how to meet people in a way that they could understand his message and respond to it. And he knew that people were different. Some people really want that sort of philosophical debate as an important aspect of their faith. And they might be interested in getting deep into theology, which is this, how we talk about God. Other people are not as focused on, breaking down their beliefs into all the different components and really studying that, but are more interested in hearing the stories and also in doing the work. And we all have different gifts as well. Paul writes about that in his letter to the Corinthians and his letter to the Romans. And so as we read through Acts and as we see all these different places where he went and the other apostles went, they encountered different people, and they realized that faith happens differently for others. And so as we encounter people who have different beliefs from us, or who have different life experience, and then just different interests, it's important to remember that no one's faith has to be exactly the same as ours, but our message is always for them to understand the importance of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, and how that changes us and changes our world. And so whoever in your life needs to know that, or could benefit from like having a conversation about it, think about how they relate to their faith, how they learn and grow, how they can come to this understanding that maybe you have and you feel really comfortable in or grounded in, like Paul did, knowing that everyone's different and God made us that way, and that is wonderful. So share the good news of Jesus in ways that people can understand with your words and with your actions, and with how you spend all of your time and money and energy. And that is what being a disciple is. So we can appreciate Paul, even if he gets on our nerves sometimes, and we can appreciate our differences. And that is something that the world around us doesn't always tell us to appreciate. So those are my thoughts on Acts 17, and we will be back next week with Acts 18. See you then. Bye.